You have no idea what kind of secret was hidden for centuries inside an object the size of an ordinary nut. Today, I'm going to show you an artifact that doesn't just surprise, it completely shatters the history we thought we knew. A tiny object created in the 16th century turned out to be so disturbingly precise, so insanely complex, and so outrageously perfect that even modern researchers were forced to ask one deeply uncomfortable question. How was this even possible without modern technology, without advanced optics, and without the tools we take for granted today? But that is only the beginning. Behind this miniature masterpiece lies far more than the work of a gifted craftsman. There is a tangled web of missing names, vanished techniques, religious upheaval, luxury for the elite, and mysteries that still refuse to let historians sleep in peace. Why did these objects suddenly disappear? Who really made them? And what were they truly meant to be? An instrument of faith, a symbol of power, or a defiant challenge to time itself? And here is the most shocking part. The deeper scientists dig into these artifacts, the more disturbing the truth becomes. Because every new discovery does not calm the mystery, it makes it even darker, even stranger, and even harder to explain. Watch this video until the end, because right now we are about to uncover the hidden details, the unsettling secrets, and the exclusive facts that will make you look at the 16th century in a completely different way. So what exactly is this object that still makes scholars tense up and museum curators lower their voices? It is the so-called prayer nut, a tiny carved object that at first glance could be dismissed as a trinket, a luxury bauble, a strange toy for the rich. That first glance is a trap. In reality, the prayer nut was several things at once: a mark of private devotion, a personal relic, a status symbol, and a cold display of cultivated power. This was not merely a miniature. It was a pocket altar for people who wanted to hold sacred drama in the palm of a hand. During the age of late Gothic splendor and the early Renaissance, these objects were not common possessions, and certainly not casual curiosities. They circulated among people of rank, money, and social ambition. Noble women carried them in velvet pouches, while high-ranking men attached them to rosaries or kept them among costly private belongings as if they were guarding a secret badge of distinction. A prayer nut did not sit quietly. It announced wealth, piety, refinement, and access. It told the world, without a single spoken word, that its owner belonged to a rarefied circle. The real shock came when the object opened. On the outside, restraint, discipline, almost deceptive modesty. On the inside, an explosion of carved narrative. The Last Judgment, the Crucifixion, the Last Supper, Christ led to Golgotha, grieving figures, hovering angels, architectural frames, tense gestures, faces alive with sorrow and awe. All of it was cut into boxwood with such ferocious precision that an object no larger than a walnut became a full theatre of faith, rank, and artistic obsession. It was not a box, it was an ambush for the eye. Not an ornament, but a compressed universe designed to seize attention and refuse to let go. This applies to the central scandal of these artifacts. The smaller the object, the louder its statement. It operated on several levels at once. For one owner, it was a device for private prayer, an intimate bridge between the believer and the sacred story. For another, it was a weapon of prestige, something to display before guests, something to use to stun a visitor, silence a rival collector, or establish superiority without speaking. In the prayer nut, devotion and display walked side by side, and that uneasy alliance is precisely what makes these objects so difficult to reduce to a single meaning. That is why calling it merely a religious miniature is a blunt and misleading simplification. It was an object with a double, even triple charge. It could be held as a holy item, exhibited as a treasure, and deployed as a quiet declaration of privilege. Look at what only I can possess. a tiny object carried the force of a grand statement. And that makes the next question even sharper. If these works were so dazzling, so prestigious, and so loaded with meaning, why did they vanish almost as abruptly as they appeared? The history of these prayer nuts does not begin in a fog of pretty legend. It begins in a very specific corner of Europe, where at the turn between the late Middle Ages and the early modern world, religion could be turned into spectacle, craftsmanship into luxury, and a tiny object into a brazen statement of refinement. The place was the Netherlands, around the period of about the year 1500, when the cities of the Low Countries were boiling with trade, money, artistic discipline, and intense devotional culture. It was there, in that dense mixture of piety, wealth, and obsessive skill, that prayer nuts emerged. Not by accident, not as the whim of a lone eccentric, but out of an environment already primed to demand exquisite religious objects. Northern Europe at that moment was not merely experiencing a religious revival, it was living under relentless spiritual pressure. Believers were expected not only to attend Mass and observe ritual, but also to keep the passion of Christ before their inner eye, to return again and again to Golgotha, to suffering, sacrifice, and redemption. Private prayer was no longer a decorative extra. It was becoming a mark of serious devotion. And this is exactly where the prayer nut entered the scene like a perfectly calculated instrument. Small, precious, portable, and intensely visual, it turned religious contemplation into something a person could carry, open, and grip in the hand, like concentrated faith. This applies to the deepest historical tension of the age. Belief was not an abstraction, but a daily practice, almost a regime of inward discipline. That is why these objects were never random curiosities. They answered a concrete hunger in the culture around them. People wanted more than sermons. They wanted to see, inspect, dwell on, and re-enter sacred scenes through concentrated visual experience. The prayer nut offered precisely that, in a brutally compressed and almost defiant form. The origins of these works are closely tied to the name of Adam Dirks. His identity still attracts serious attention from art historians because a whole cluster of astonishing carvings has been linked to his workshop. On some of these objects appears the mark AD, one of the very few solid threads scholars can actually hold on to in tracing the history of these artifacts. And this point matters. The initials should not be confused with Albrecht Dürer, even though that coincidence has repeatedly fueled amateur speculation and noisy confusion. In reality, we are dealing with another world entirely, a Northern European culture of microcarving pushed to an almost absurd extreme. And that is the decisive point. From the very beginning, the prayer nut was never just an object for prayer. It was born in a culture where the sacred and the prestigious had already locked themselves together. Yes, it could serve contemplation, inward focus, and private devotion, but at the same time it displayed the owner's rank, the workshop's brilliance, and the sheer cost of labor. The origin of the prayer nut, then, is not only a story about faith. It is a story about taste, money, power, and coded social display. And the clearer that historical setting becomes, the sharper the next question cuts. If these objects were so perfectly fitted to their age, why was the tradition so quickly driven toward extinction? The real blow to modern self-confidence does not arrive when someone hears that a prayer nut is rare. It arrives the moment the object opens. On the outside, it appears restrained, almost quiet, as if it were trying to hide its own force and price. On the inside, there is not merely carving, but a compressed religious cosmos in which every line, every figure, every gesture is designed to do one thing: tear a person out of ordinary distraction and force the eye to stop, return, and surrender to what it sees. This is no trinket tucked into the belongings of a noble owner. It is a miniature stage on which a drama of cosmic weight is performed with merciless concentration. Once the halves part, What appears is not a flat image, but a layered world, arranged with such fury and precision that the maker seems to be defying the very size of the object. Christ is led toward Golgotha. Guards crowd the scene with tense faces. Mourning women bend beneath grief. Angels hover above suffering. A surrounding crowd presses inward, and each tiny figure seems to carry a private emotional charge. One level is movement, another is sorrow, another is silent heavenly witness. All of it is packed into a space that seems too small even for a single human palm. And that is the scandal at the center of the object. The smaller the shell, the more violent the explosion of meaning inside it. This object did not function as an illustration, and it certainly was not a decorative whim. It functioned as a machine for contemplation. The owner did not simply look inside. The owner entered that miniature world through the eyes, lingered over details, moved from one scene to another, and almost lived through the imagery as a private spiritual event. A prayer nut did not entertain. It disciplined attention. It pushed the viewer toward inward concentration. It prevented the casual glance and demanded that the gaze remain trapped until the mind itself began to adjust to the rhythm of sacred narrative. This applies to the deepest structure of late medieval and early Renaissance Catholic practice. It was not enough for the believer merely to know the gospel story. The believer was expected to place the self mentally inside it, to return again and again to the passion of Christ, to contemplate suffering, sacrifice, and redemption with deliberate intensity. That is why the opening of such a nut was almost certainly bound to gesture and prayer, to the words Pater Noster, Our Father. The phrase matters, but so does the ritual around it. Hands separate the carved shells, the eyes lock into place, the lips begin to whisper familiar words, and the tiny wooden world ceases to be an object of inspection and becomes a passage into inner experience. And still the violence of its effect is not exhausted. What is so striking about the inner world of the prayer nut is that it never feels cute, never feels playful, never slips into the safety of mere miniature charm. There is nothing toy-like here. There is gravity, darkness, compression, and an almost brutal seriousness of religious intention. Faces are not simply carved, they are strained. Drapery is not simply elegant, it deepens the drama. Architectural elements do not merely decorate, they guide the eye, almost directing the spiritual movement of the viewer. What we are looking at is not a dollhouse of piety. It is a sermon compressed into wood, a miniature altar engineered to strike not by size, but by density. That is one of the most unsettling truths about these artifacts. The prayer nut was too small to look monumental, yet far too full of inner force to be dismissed as a thing. It fused private prayer, visual shock, and the staged power of sacred imagery into a single object. A tiny piece of carved wood behaved like a vast church, only without walls, choir, or congregation. One person, two carved halves, several scenes, and suddenly the viewer was no longer holding a pocket-sized rarity, but a concentrated universe of belief. At that point, the illusion collapses. This is not ornament, it is an instrument of spiritual impact hidden inside wood. But were these objects purely religious? That is where the comfortable explanation begins to collapse. It is far too easy to label the prayer nut as nothing more than an instrument of devotion, to package it neatly inside church history and to move on. The evidence refuses to cooperate. Documents from the 17th century show that some of these nuts were found not in monastic quiet and not solely in the hands of people seeking private prayer, but in a very different environment altogether, the Cabinet of Curiosities. There they stood beside precious stones, mechanical clocks, rare shells, anatomical models, and other prized objects collected by wealthy owners who wanted to astonish their visitors. That changes everything. In such a setting, the prayer nut stops being only a gateway to contemplation. It becomes an object of display, a polished instrument of prestige, a small but vicious proof of taste, rank, and possession. It was no longer opened only in a moment of prayer. It was shown. It was presented. It was placed among other rarities so that every guest entering the room would immediately understand. The owner was not a collector of ordinary things, but of exceptions, marvels, historical anomalies, objects that almost nobody else could hope to possess. In this new role, the prayer nut may have spoken even louder than it did in religious life. This applies to one of the hardest truths about luxury objects. They rarely remain confined to a single meaning. Yesterday, a sacred item. Today, a rarity. Tomorrow, an instrument of status. The prayer nut was exactly that kind of unstable and dangerous object. It was too beautiful, too intricate, too expensive in labor ever to remain merely a silent aid to prayer. Everything about it pushed it toward elite consumption. Its minuteness, its rarity, its technical refinement, its hidden mechanics, its theatrical effect when opened. It almost demanded a collector. A cabinet of curiosities was not just a room full of beautiful things. It was a theater of superiority. Its owner assembled evidence of personal weight, cultivated knowledge, and the right to look down upon the world from above. In that environment, the prayer nut performed perfectly. It brought together several qualities the elite adored: religious depth, technical improbability, artistic refinement, and scarcity. A whole social performance could be staged around it. First, the modest outer shell. Then, the slow opening of the carved halves. Then, the revelation of a miniature world, so dense and so precise that any observer would be stunned into silence. This was not an object that merely sat inside a collection. It acted, it performed, it commanded attention no less forcefully than it once commanded the concentration of the devout. That is why the history of the prayer nut is no longer just a history of religion or art. It is also a history of social meaning and staged power. What we are looking at is an object balanced between faith and display, between inward discipline and the cold game of status. The farther it moved away from religious daily use, the more strongly it was pulled into the world of luxury and exclusivity. There is nothing accidental about that. Any object that required years of labor, rare mastery, and astonishing precision was almost destined to become a symbol of distinction. It could not remain modest for long. So the prayer nut underwent a dangerous transformation. It did not entirely lose its sacred aura, but another layer began to grow around it. The layer of collecting hunger, aristocratic vanity, and the glitter of prestige. It continued to speak about belief, but it also began to speak, more and more loudly, about ownership and social dominance. That is a very different register. Not humility, but display. Not only prayer, but exhibition. Not only a devotional object, but an elite possession placed beside the costliest wonders of its age. And after that, the next question cuts even deeper. What exactly vanished later? The spiritual practice itself, or the fashion among the powerful for tiny masterpieces that had spent too long serving two masters at once? This is where easy admiration ends and a colder, harsher conversation begins. One may praise the beauty of prayer nuts as much as one likes. One may wrap them in the fog of mystery, but the central question remains brutally intact. How did craftsmen of the early 16th century achieve a density of detail that still leaves modern researchers visibly shaken? This is no longer a discussion about taste, religion, or luxury. It is a discussion about precision so aggressive that it feels almost insulting to modern assumptions about what handwork was supposed to be capable of. That is exactly why researchers turned not to legend, not to romantic speculation, and not to museum reverence, but to hard investigation. Microtomography made it possible to look inside these objects without cutting them apart, without damaging the carving, and without resorting to the clumsy violence of physical disassembly. And that is where the matter became truly uncomfortable for anyone inclined to underestimate the past. The scans showed that certain elements, folds of clothing, facial contours, hand gestures, architectural details, descend to a depth of less than a millimeter. Not vaguely tiny, not very fine by impression, less than a millimeter in literal measurable fact. After that, any argument over whether these objects are genuinely extraordinary begins to look embarrassingly weak. This applies to the point at which admiration must submit to evidence. When details reach a depth on that scale, chance is immediately ruled out. There is no room here for sloppiness, no room for the fantasy that the result came from luck, from a sentimental tale of inspiration, or from an unusually forgiving material. What stands before us is a disciplined working system, one built with near fanatical control. And it is scientific analysis, not decorative wonder, that reveals the true magnitude of this assault on matter. The force of that conclusion is sharpened by the nature of the wood itself. Boxwood is not a soft or indulgent material that welcomes careless tools. It is dense, hard, slow-growing timber that does not forgive mistakes. It holds shape with almost offensive stubbornness, yet that very resistance is what allows minute carving to survive where another material would splinter, blur, or collapse. Researchers stress that the wood may have been seasoned for years, sometimes for decades, until it reached a density almost comparable to bone. And across that surface, the craftsman moved, not crudely, not approximately, but with a degree of control that would sound impossible today if the artifact itself were not sitting there as evidence. But the stark figure of less than a millimeter is only part of the impact. The more serious point is that microtomography revealed not just minuteness, but structured intention. The details are not scattered randomly. They are subordinated to overall composition, spatial calculation, and a hierarchy of planes. One figure does not crush another. One layer does not destroy its neighbor. The scene does not collapse under its own density. On an area so small, this becomes something close to engineering violence against the limits of material. Far too much precision for a simple devotional trinket. Far too much calculation for a charming little religious object. This applies to the most dangerous conclusion contained in the scientific data. The problem is no longer that artisans of the past were talented. No serious person denies that. The problem is that their level of control over tool, material, and space appears higher than the modern mind is psychologically prepared to grant them. It is easier for us to talk about mystery, lost knowledge, or some unexplainable marvel than to accept the harder truth. In the early 16th century, there existed workshop practices whose density of manual precision still looks almost defiant today. That is why every new tomographic scan of these objects lands like a slap across modern complacency. The research did not dissolve the mystery, it made it heavier. Once it was possible to say only that these carvings seemed unbelievable. Now the wording must change. The research has shown that the unbelievable is real. And after that, the question stops sounding like museum poetry and begins to sound like a serious historical accusation against our arrogance. If craftsmen of that age could reach such precision without modern optics and digital control, what else have we dismissed as impossible merely because it was convenient for us to do so? Behind this carving stands not a romantic fairy tale of inspiration, but a brutal factory of patience. A prayer nut was never born quickly, never slipped out of a craftsman's hands in a matter of weeks, and never tolerated a casual attitude toward material. Everything began with boxwood, a dense, stubborn, almost hostile timber in its character. This is not soft wood that obediently accepts any line. Boxwood demands discipline, precision, and nearly fanatical control because the smallest mistake is not forgiven. One wrong movement, and months, even years of preparation collapse at once. That material is where the first real price of the masterpiece is hidden. Boxwood was valued not for surface beauty, and certainly not for decorative softness, but for what it contained inside. It grows slowly, compacts over time, and after proper seasoning, becomes almost bone-like in density. At that point, it is no longer merely wood. It is a substance that holds form with cold severity. Because of that density, the maker could cut deeper, sharper, and more precisely, carving folds of clothing, facial contours, fingers, architectural details, and layered scenes without the surface dissolving into weakness. But that possibility came at a brutal cost. The currency was time, and the payment was enormous. The wood was not taken into use immediately. It was seasoned for years, and in some cases for decades. No serious craftsman would have risked this level of work on fresh timber. The material had to stabilize, lose excess moisture, and acquire the inner hardness, without which miniature carving would turn into reckless self-destruction. This applies to the central fact. A prayer nut began long before the craftsman even lifted a tool. While a patron waited, while the market desired rarity, while elite taste demanded another marvel, the material itself was already enduring a long, silent, unforgiving preparation. Then came the labor, and this is the point at which the entire story becomes almost offensive to common sense. The making of a single prayer nut could take from 2 to 5 years. Not days, not months, years. And this was not a monumental altar, not the facade of a cathedral, not an object dominating a city square. It was an item that fit in the palm of a hand. That is one of the sharpest paradoxes of the age. A tiny object consumed a monstrous amount of time, as if it were not a luxury item at all, but the secret project of an obsessed craftsman, determined to defeat the limits of material, scale, and endurance. Every stage demanded its own ordeal. First came the selection of the proper piece of wood, then the long preparation of that material. After that, the planning of composition, because inside such a minuscule volume, the maker had to place not one figure, but a whole narrative scene with several planes: architecture, motion, gesture, and emotional tension. Then came the carving itself, where one false line could destroy everything. After that came assembly, fitting, hinges, closures, internal mechanics. None of this resembles the work of hurried hands. It was almost monastic in discipline and nearly insane in the quantity of labor invested. At that point, it becomes obvious why such objects could never be truly common. Their price was not determined only by rarity of subject and not only by the prestige of the owner. The real cost lay in the fact that years of human life were compressed inside a single prayer nut. Not hours of labor, but fragments of eyesight, concentration, physical endurance, and nerve. Such an object could not be made cheaply. It could not be made quickly. It could not be made indifferently. By the very logic of its making, it was destined to become rare. This also explains the respect these artifacts still command centuries later. What stands before us is not just a beautiful old object. It is the result of an almost monstrous concentration of work, where the material resisted, time stretched outward, and the craftsman kept forcing detail deeper and deeper into matter. That is why the prayer nut matters not only as a work of art, and not only as a devotional object. It matters as physical proof of the degree to which a person of the past was willing to pour years of life into a thing that most modern viewers still cannot fully see without special optics. But the most astonishing part begins the moment the prayer nut stops being only a story about carving. For too long, these objects have been treated as miniature scenes, elegant religious luxuries, refined curiosities for the elite, victories of eye and hand over scale. That alone is enough to provoke admiration. But behind the visible beauty lies another layer, harder, colder, and far more disruptive to comfortable assumptions. A prayer nut is not only a microsculpture, it is also a construction. It is an object in which art unexpectedly locks itself to engineering. Some examples are made of 6 segments, others of 8. There are even pieces in which researchers count as many as 10 opening parts, all connected with unnerving precision. Every panel must open at the right moment. Every element has to align with its neighbor. Every structural line must endure pressure, movement, time, and human touch. At that point, we are no longer looking merely at carved imagery. We are looking at a system. Tiny, fragile, intimate, and yet calculated with such severity that it seems less like the product of a woodcarver's bench and more like the work of a master of mechanisms. That is where ordinary admiration starts to crack. It is one thing to carve a complex, sacred scene inside a shell the size of a walnut. It is something else entirely to make the whole object function as a precise mechanism in which opening becomes part of the design. A prayer nut did not simply present an image. It revealed it. It controlled the instant of appearance. It built tension between an outward modesty and an inward explosion of meaning. This is almost stage direction in wood, almost an engineered calculation of impact. This applies to the central shift in how these artifacts must be understood. The maker was not creating a static object, but a choreography of movement. While the nut is closed, it conceals. When the carved sections part, it discloses. When the eye enters the interior, a second phase of force begins. That means the artisan was thinking not only about composition, faces, gestures, and symbols. He was thinking about hinges, joints, pressure points, tolerances, and how the parts would behave after years of handling, how the wood would respond to stress, and how the whole object would preserve integrity through repeated use. At this scale, that is no longer mere craftsmanship. It is cold engineering discipline. That is why the comparison to secret locks is not decorative language, but something close to a literal definition. Many prayer nuts operate according to the logic of a precious puzzle. On the outside, a silent shell. On the inside, a world carefully hidden from immediate view. Between the two lies a system of opening that creates the effect of initiation. The owner did not simply look at the object. The owner passed through a ritual of access. It was opened almost like a miniature safe, containing not coins or letters, but sacred scenes, social prestige, rarity and labor compressed into wood. And at this point, it becomes impossible to classify the prayer nut as only a work of art. Art governs the image. Engineering governs the behavior of the object. In these artifacts, image and behavior are fused so tightly that neither can be separated from the other. If the interior scene had been magnificent, but the opening crude, half the force would have vanished. If the mechanism had been exact, but the carving weak, the meaning would have collapsed. What was required was a double victory, over material and over construction. That is what turned a tiny object into a declaration of rare mastery. This applies to the social dimension as well. For elite owners, such an object was precious precisely because it united two forms of superiority at once. The first was artistic. Look at the fineness. The second was technical. Look at how it works. The owner possessed not merely something to pray with or display, but a miniature marvel of controlled form, movement, and secrecy. These objects impressed not only the devout, but anyone capable of recognizing the value of hidden mechanics, exact fitting, and intellectual design. In the end, the prayer nut rises to an entirely different category. What stands before us is no longer merely a wood carving, and no longer merely a devotional object. It is Renaissance micromechanics wrapped in the image of sanctity. A tiny artifact behaves like a complex device in which every panel, every segment, every concealed transition contributes to a unified effect. That is why the sharpest conclusion sounds almost confrontational. These masters were not creating miniatures, but pocket-sized mechanisms of awe and reverence. That is what makes the prayer nut not a charming relic of the past, but hard evidence that engineering intelligence was speaking the language of art long before modernity claimed a monopoly on precision. And here the history of the prayer nut takes a sharp, almost brutal turn. Everything that had once seemed to embody refined devotion, private piety, and cultivated taste suddenly came under attack. The production of these objects did not slowly fade away. It did not decline gently through boredom or natural exhaustion. It stopped abruptly, almost offensively abruptly, and behind that rupture stood not chance, but one of the most violent shifts in European history, the Reformation. When Martin Luther launched his assault in the early 16th century against the Catholic use of relics and religious imagery, the blow did not strike church hierarchy alone. It struck an entire world of objects through which faith had once become visible, tangible, and personal. Things that had long functioned as aids to prayer were increasingly recast as suspicious excess, as dangerous ornament, as material temptations capable of drawing the believer away from God and toward attachment to form. Luther criticized such objects as signs of superstition, and in that new atmosphere, the prayer nut stopped smelling of devotion and began to smell of ideological danger. What had once been praised as an aid to concentration could now be dismissed as unnecessary luxury, hovering on the edge of spiritual error. Where one generation saw a sacred scene, another began to see unhealthy attachment to image. Where there had once been a practice of inward contemplation, there now appeared an accusation of excessive dependence on material forms. For artifacts like these, that meant only one thing: the cultural ground was being ripped out from beneath them. And the moment that ground began to crack, the tradition built upon it started to collapse. This applies to the core mechanism of historical destruction. It is not only objects that disappear, but the environment that makes them necessary. The prayer nut could not survive by itself. It required a culture in which sacred imagery held an honored and legitimate place in private religious life. It required a devotional structure in which inward experience was intensified through object, sight, and touch. The Reformation struck directly at that structure. It did not merely change taste, it changed the entire logic by which images were allowed to function as intermediaries between believer and the sacred. In the Protestant regions of Northern Europe, that shift acted like a sentence. Prayer nuts fell out of use not because they had suddenly become inferior, not because artisans lost the skill to make them, and not because viewers ceased to marvel at extraordinary workmanship. No, what changed was the ideological temperature of the age itself. Under the new conditions, such objects came to look suspect, outdated, or simply inappropriate. And for an art that depended on an elite circle of patrons and on labor of almost absurd difficulty, that was enough to begin the process of disappearance. What makes the story even harsher is that the very refinement of the prayer nut worked against it. The more sophisticated the object, the more deeply it was tied to visual devotion, and the more vulnerable it became in an age increasingly committed to stripping faith of material mediation. The tiny masterpiece was suddenly no longer a marvel, but a problem. No longer a sign of piety, but an awkward remnant of an older world. That is the real historical irony. An object created to intensify prayer became a casualty of a new kind of religious fervor. This applies as well to the scale of the Reformation itself. We are not dealing with a private scholarly dispute or a theological quarrel conducted for intellectual sport. The entire spiritual map of Europe was being redrawn. Sermons changed, habits changed, the standing of sacred images changed. The very idea of visual mediation was thrown into crisis. In such a storm, the prayer nut was too fragile, too specialized, and too deeply bound to a fading order to survive intact. Its disappearance was not some random loss of artistic fashion. It was a symptom of civilizational rupture. And that is why the history of the prayer nut is not merely the story of a beautiful object that vanished. It is the story of how a vast religious upheaval swept away a whole category of things once considered necessary, treasured, and intimately important. Yesterday they were preserved like treasure. Today they remain as silent witnesses to the speed with which an age can reject what it recently valued. After that, it becomes impossible to look at these miniatures as charming museum curiosities. They are fragments of a world crushed not by poverty and not by forgetfulness, but by a transformation in the very spiritual authority governing Europe. But blaming everything on the Reformation alone would be far too convenient and far too lazy. History almost never moves on a single cause, especially when the objects in question are expensive, rare, and tied to the changing appetites of the powerful. Yes, the religious climate shifted. Yes, sacred imagery came under harsher scrutiny. But that still does not fully explain why prayer nuts nearly vanished. Another force was at work, colder, earthier, and far more ruthless: money. And where money moves, fashion follows. Where fashion shifts, status display shifts with it. This has to be stated plainly. The prayer nut was never a luxury for the broad public. It belonged to a world in which the wealthy could afford to purchase years of another person's life, compressed into a single tiny object. But aristocratic taste does not stand still. It is greedy, restless, and notoriously ungrateful. One season, the elite admires a marvel hidden in the palm of a hand. The next, it demands an object that strikes the eye instantly, without explanation, without unfolding panels, without requiring close inspection. That is where the prayer nut began to lose ground to other forms of luxury that were larger, louder, and more obvious in their effect. Grand altarpieces, gilded objects, monumental painted surfaces, massive works in precious materials, possessions that could dominate a room and announce wealth at once. These served aristocratic vanity more efficiently. The prayer nut demanded time. It had to be brought near. It had to be opened. It had to be examined. Its force lay in refinement, not in immediate visual assault. But elite taste was turning toward exactly the opposite. It wanted not a whisper, but a shout. Not something that invited concentration, but something that seized control of space the instant it appeared. This applies to the central social logic of status. What matters is not only rarity, but the speed with which rarity can produce an effect. The prayer nut was a masterpiece for the attentive eye. Aristocratic fashion increasingly demanded masterpieces that landed like blows. An object had to dazzle at once, preferably through size, brilliance, material, and a price legible even to the most ignorant visitor. On that field, miniature carving was at a disadvantage. It remained exquisite, but it no longer served the newer rules of visible superiority as efficiently as its rivals. There is another uncomfortable point that cannot be ignored. The prayer nut was disastrously expensive to produce. Not merely expensive, but nearly absurd in relation to the labor invested. When a single object absorbs years of work, when the material itself requires long preparation, and when the result remains tiny and legible only to a narrow circle of connoisseurs, a brutal question appears. Is this economically sensible? For the artisan, the answer was doubtful. For the patron, it remained prestigious, but increasingly less practical. For the workshop, it was risky. One commission could consume years, while the finished object no longer matched the evolving market for luxury display. That is why miniature carving began to look like a form of magnificent but unprofitable stubbornness. It demanded monastic discipline from the craftsman and offered, in return, an object that was becoming harder to sell as the ideal symbol of power and taste. The luxury market loves rarity, but it does not love slowness once louder alternatives arrive. And they did arrive. Wealthy patrons shifted toward forms of status that occupied more space, produced faster impact, and worked better in the logic of public display. The disappearance of the prayer nut therefore stops being a purely religious story and becomes a story of market forces, fashion, and a changing visual regime of power. Yesterday, subtlety carried value. Today, immediate brilliance takes the throne. Yesterday, the elite performed refined exclusivity. Today, it wants domination through scale and instant legibility. In that conflict, the prayer nut turned out to be too intricate, too slow, and too intellectually demanding for a new age of theatrical luxury. This applies to one of the harshest truths about masterpieces. Sometimes they disappear not because they become worse, but because the world begins to favor forms of impression that are simpler, louder, and more profitable. The prayer nut was not destroyed by theology alone. It was finished off by the market, by fashion, and by the caprice of the wealthy eye. That is where the bitterness lies. An object packed with years of labor, rare skill, and almost unbearable precision was pushed aside not because it lost value, but because it ceased to function as the most convenient weapon in the competition for prestige. But the disappearance of the prayer nut was not total, final, or absolute. These objects did not vanish without a trace, did not sink into historical emptiness, and were not swept away to the last splinter. Some of them survived, but survival came at a strange price. They ceased to be objects of living practice and became exceptions, rarities, things that no longer served but instead testified. Once they were opened in the silence of private prayer. Later they were opened in a completely different register, as precious evidence of a vanished world. That shift was severe and almost humiliating to the original nature of the object itself. The prayer nut had been made for touch, for concentrated looking, for inward religious movement. But over time it appeared less and less in the hands of the devout, and more often in the possession of collectors, keepers, and owners of rarities who saw in it not only a sacred object, but also a trophy of taste, a sign of distinction, a proof of access to something nearly unattainable. In this way, the object moved slowly from private spiritual practice into the world of collections, display cases, and catalogues. There was something cold in that transition. The living purpose faded, while the value only increased. This applies to one of the strangest destinies in the history of art. An object may lose its function and yet gain in price, symbolic weight, and cultural importance. That is exactly what happened to the prayer nut. Its path began to resemble the fate of ancient cameos, astrolabes, and other complex artifacts that had once been embedded in everyday use, only to be torn out of that setting and transferred into another dimension, the dimension of rarity. In that realm, what matters is no longer daily function, but preservation, provenance, uniqueness, and degree of exclusion from the ordinary world. And the fewer such objects remained, the more intensely they attracted attention. Collectors played a double role in this story. On the one hand, it is because of them that some prayer nuts reach the present at all. They were not melted down, broken apart, or discarded as outdated remnants of an older age. On the other hand, the very logic of collecting severed these objects once and for all from the environment in which they had truly lived. Now the nut was valued not only for scenes of the crucifixion or the Last Supper, not only for spiritual depth, but also for rarity, mechanical intricacy, workshop attribution, surviving traces of gilding, and the power to astonish not the believer, but the connoisseur. This was not merely preservation, it was a change in the mode of existence. And that is how the second life of the object begins, colder, more elite, but also longer. The prayer nut stops being part of the daily rhythm of devotion and becomes a museum argument against oblivion. It is no longer carried in a velvet pouch and no longer handled together with prayer beads. It is studied, described, attributed, insured, placed in collections, and displayed as evidence of how far a person of the past could go in obsession with form, faith, and workmanship. There is a harsh irony in that. The object was saved precisely because it ceased to be an ordinary object. This applies as well to the museum silence in which the prayer nut now lives. Behind glass, it no longer participates in prayer, no longer accompanies the motion of the hand, no longer answers the whisper of Pater Noster. Yet it continues to act in another way. It functions now as a stubborn fragment of a vanished civilization, as a concentration of memory, as a tiny challenge to the superficial eye. People no longer bow before it in the old manner. They fall silent before it for another reason, because it becomes suddenly clear how many epochs, habits, and meanings have been compressed into that minute volume of wood. That is why it would be inaccurate to speak of the prayer nut as a lost object. It was not lost. It changed status. It moved from the hand to the display case, from private ritual to museum context, from use to contemplation. And within that shift lies its harshest victory over time. By losing its original place in life, it gained another one, the place of rarity, something that can no longer be returned to the past, yet can no longer be erased from history. And this is the point at which the prayer nut finally leaves the territory of accidental rarity and enters the arena of global cultural recognition. These objects are not stored just anywhere, not left to gather dust on forgotten provincial shelves, and not treated as charming exotica for a narrow circle of enthusiasts. They are held by some of the greatest museums in the world, and that fact alone speaks louder than 100 admiring phrases. When an artifact is preserved by the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, and the Musée de Cluny in Paris, the message is unmistakable. This is not a curiosity, but an object granted the authority to stand for an entire age, an entire structure of taste, faith, craftsmanship, and power. It is important to understand that a museum does not bestow such status out of politeness. The display cases of major institutions are not filled with old things simply because they survived. They hold objects that have endured a merciless selection through time, provenance, condition, scholarly attention, and cultural force. The prayer nut passed through that selection and did not dissolve among the thousands of surviving works from the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. On the contrary, it proved itself one of those rare objects capable of arresting the eye, even when surrounded by giants of painting, goldwork, reliquaries, and ceremonial church splendor. Recognition on that scale cannot be explained by age alone. Something else is at work: density of meaning, an almost indecent refinement of execution, and a rarity that institutions are forced to acknowledge as exceptional. This applies to the most important point. Institutions of this caliber do not merely store an object, they fix its place on the map of world memory. As long as a thing remains in a private collection, it may be precious, but it also remains almost mute. Once it enters the museum canon, its voice grows louder. It begins to speak not only on behalf of an owner or collector, but on behalf of the cultural history of Europe itself. That is why listing these museums does not read like dry reference material. It reads like a roll call of the highest authorities confirming that the prayer nut is not an eccentric miniature for specialists, but an object of the first rank. Especially revealing is one of the most complex known examples, preserved in the Abegg Stiftung collection in Rigisberg. This specimen has long been treated as an almost aggressive benchmark of difficulty. Inside it are seams of the crucifixion and the brazen serpent, carved into an area of less than 10 centimeters. That alone sounds like a challenge to common sense, but the matter does not end with scale. What matters is the density with which the maker packed drama, symbolism, architectural rhythm, and compositional discipline into that space. This is not an object that merely displays skill. It almost mocks the assumed limits of the human hand. Additional weight is given to this example by the traces of gilding that it still preserves. That is not a decorative detail or a pleasant bonus for museum labeling. It is direct evidence of the object's exceptional value already in the 16th century. Gilding means that this was not merely a pious object and not merely a technical rarity, but a work surrounded from the beginning by special attention, financial investment, and a clear sense of prestige. What we are looking at is not a poor relic for humble use, but a work that carried the mark of high status from its earliest life. That is why its presence in a major collection today feels less like accidental survival and more like the logical continuation of its historical destiny. This also explains why the concrete geography of museums matters so much in the larger story of prayer nuts. As long as one speaks of an abstract masterpiece, it remains possible to dismiss interest in it as the fashion of scholars or the narrow admiration of specialists. But once Amsterdam, London, New York, Paris, and Rigisburg stand behind the object, once catalogues, conservation departments, scholarly publications, and institutional guardianship gather around it, the argument is over. The prayer nut receives more than recognition. It receives a cultural verdict in the strongest possible sense. Yes, this is an exceptional thing. Yes, this is something the world is obliged to preserve. Yes, this is an object through which the height of craftsmanship and the intensity of spiritual culture in that age can be judged. And so a tiny object once hidden in the palm of a hand and accessible only to a few becomes inscribed into the larger map of civilization. From private prayer to world museums. From personal relic to international cultural canon. From the silence of a velvet pouch to the lit display case before which visitors from many countries stop and stare. There is a heavy, almost sarcastic justice in that trajectory. What was once made for the few ultimately became part of humanity's inheritance, but only after surviving neglect, the whims of collectors, and the iron examination of museum authority. But the story of the prayer nut did not end there. The most intriguing phase began precisely when it seemed that these tiny relics of the past had been assigned only one final role: to lie silently behind glass and wait for the rare attentive gaze. In reality, the opposite happened. Modern science dragged these artifacts out of museum stillness and forced them back into the center of the conversation about craftsmanship, technology, and the limits of the human hand. What once looked buried inside history received a second birth in the 21st century, hard, precise, and almost confrontational. In the past, a prayer nut could only be examined from the outside, and if one was lucky, cautiously opened. Now researchers have gained the ability to go further without breaking the object, without risking damage to the carving, and without harming the fragile wood. This is where microtomography entered the scene. The method made it possible to penetrate the nut from within, to see hidden layers, internal mechanics, material density, scene structure, joints, cavities, and minute elements that the unaided eye simply cannot hold with enough precision under normal conditions. And this is where the result became deeply uncomfortable for anyone who still imagines the past as dark and technically helpless. The deeper modern equipment looked inside, the louder the mastery of the old carvers became. This applies to the central paradox of the new phase of study. Modern technology did not expose the old artifact as a charming illusion. It did the opposite. It confirmed its reality and made that reality heavier. If the prayer nut once astonished as a museum rarity, it now began to press on the modern imagination as documented proof of apparently impossible precision. Tomographic slices, digital models, three-dimensional reconstructions. None of this weakened the sense of wonder. It intensified it. Science did not break the spell. It made the spell officially recorded. What matters especially is that digital reconstruction created a new form of access to the object. The original is too fragile. It cannot be endlessly opened, turned in the hands, and subjected to repeated stress as if it were an ordinary thing without historical cost. Every act of physical contact already carries risk. A digital copy changes that. A virtual model can be opened again and again. It can be enlarged, separated into layers, examined from different angles, and revisited at the level of tiny details that no museum visitor can truly absorb in a few seconds before a case. In this way, the old artifact gains new life, not through replacement of the original, but through the expansion of access to it. That is why the creation of three-dimensional models in Toronto became more than a technical episode. It was almost symbolic. A prayer nut born in a workshop of the early 16th century suddenly begins to exist in digital space as well. It can be opened virtually. One can look inside without touching the wood. One can study not only what a 16th century owner was meant to see, but also what remains concealed from ordinary sight even now. This is no longer museum passivity, it is the return of the object to active cultural circulation. It works again, provokes again, and once more forces specialists to ask uncomfortable questions about the technologies of the past. This also applies to the logic of modern knowledge itself. We are no longer satisfied with a beautiful display case and a short label beside an exhibit. We want to break an object down without harming it, to scan it, reconstruct it, translate it into data, compare it, model it, and test hypotheses against it. The prayer nut has turned out to be an almost perfect target for that scientific assault. There is too much hidden inside it, too much density, too much inner architecture to leave it alone. It almost taunts the researcher. Go on, try to understand how this was done. And every new technological attempt to understand it confirms the same old uncomfortable truth. The masters of the past were dangerously good. But the harshest fact in this whole development is that the digital age has not displaced the original. It has only sharpened its value. The more advanced scanning methods become, the clearer it is how fragile and unrepeatable the original object remains. The more exact the three-dimensional model becomes, the stronger the awareness that behind it stands a real thing that survived centuries, ideological conflict, changing taste, neglect, and museum isolation. Technology does not cancel the aura of the artifact. It intensifies that aura through knowledge. It allows us not only to admire, but to understand why this small piece of wood continues to unsettle everything we think we know about the past. That is what its second birth truly means. First, the prayer nut lived as an object of faith. Then it lived as a rarity of collections. Now it also lives as an object of high-precision scientific research and digital reconstruction. It has returned to modernity not as a dusty remnant, but as an active participant in a new argument about craft, engineering, memory, and the limits of technology. There is an almost mocking justice in that. Something created without microscopes, without computers, and without digital imaging now forces those very tools to work at full stretch, merely to approach an understanding of another age's skill. But the longer one looks at a prayer nut, the more disturbing one question becomes. Not how it was made, but who exactly made it. Before us stands an object in which every line betrays an iron hand, a controlled eye, and an almost frightening discipline. Before us is something that consumed years, eyesight, nerves, and life itself. And yet, the name of the maker is usually dissolved into emptiness. Not a signature, but silence. Not a biography, but a void. Not the person, but only the trace of that person's work, preserved in wood more precisely than in any archive. That is where the real insolence of this story lies. The modern world worships names. It wants an author, a personality, a portrait, a fate, documents, letters, patrons, pupils, rivals, family links. But in the case of most prayer nuts, all of that slips away. Art historians can argue about workshops, regional markers, circles of influence, and affinities with particular artistic environments, but the moment the conversation reaches the concrete individual, the whole picture begins to fray. There are too few direct testimonies, too few secure anchors, too many objects made with astonishing precision, and too few people who can be named without risk of error. Even where the name of Adam Dirks appears, certainty does not become complete. Yes, a remarkable group of works is associated with him. Yes, the mark AD gives researchers at least some hard surface on which to stand. But that foothold does not transform the whole body of related artifacts into a clear catalogue of authorship. On the contrary, the closer one looks, the more obvious it becomes that beyond a few relative attributions, there stretches an almost continuous territory of anonymity. Not accidental anonymity, but stubborn, structural, almost mocking anonymity. The object survived, the hands disappeared. This applies to one of the harshest losses in the history of craftsmanship. We see the result with alarming clarity, but we do not see the person who paid for it with personal strength and years of life. There is no neatly assembled gallery of names, no long lists of commissions, no full chronicle of workshops from which one might trace who made these pocket worlds, when and for whom. All that remains are indirect signs: style, carving habits, the way faces are formed, the way backgrounds are handled, the placement of figures, the distribution of tension within a scene. The researcher is forced to move almost blindly, like an investigator across scorched ground. There is a special, almost cruel irony in that. These masters produced objects for the chosen few, for people of rank, for a world that valued rarity, complexity, and prestige. One would such works should have left behind a rich documentary trail. But no, history took almost everything except the objects themselves. It is as if time deliberately preserved the result while erasing the authorial shadow in order to deepen the mystery, so that we might admire the precision but never come fully close, in human terms, to the one who sat over that boxwood for hours, days, and years, grinding deeper and deeper into the material. Some researchers have suggested that such work may have been produced under conditions of near isolation, not in a noisy public environment, but in a workshop where a maker labored alone, or within a very narrow circle, cut off from unnecessary eyes and absorbed in the process with almost monastic severity. This does not sound like poetic embellishment. It sounds like a logical consequence of the work itself. Precision on this level requires not only technique, but a special mode of existence. Slow, enclosed, merciless toward the self. And if that is true, then the anonymity becomes even heavier. We are no longer dealing merely with unnamed craftsmen, but with people who disappeared so deeply into their labor that history barely retained even the outline of their faces. This also applies to the sense of incompletion that haunts every serious discussion of prayer nuts. The more science learns about the material, the construction, and the microscopic depth of the carving, the sharper the human emptiness at the center of the story becomes. We can scan the wood, we can build three-dimensional models, we can measure the depth of a cut, analyze technique, compare stylistic features. But none of that returns the maker's voice. It does not return the gesture, the hesitation, the fatigue, the ambition, the fear of ruining work already burdened with years of effort. Technology expands knowledge of the object, but it does not dissolve the central human darkness. That is why the question of authorship strikes harder than any elegant legend. It shifts the entire discussion from admiration into loss. We realize that what stands before us is not an impersonal miracle, but the trace of specific people who had hands, character, training, perhaps pupils, perhaps patrons, perhaps their own ideas about glory and devotion. And almost all of that has leaked away. What remains is the carving alone, as evidence, as an imprint, as the mute cry of mastery stripped of its name. And the more perfect the prayer nut appears, the louder that absence becomes. Not only as a mystery of art history, but as a cold reminder of how easily the past can turn human lives into anonymous magnificence. And yet history does not surrender completely. Yes, the names are mostly gone. Yes, the archives keep a suspiciously loud silence. Yes, most of the makers disappeared into shadow so deeply that the craft itself almost seems built upon a principle of voluntary erasure. But researchers did not fold their hands and accept anonymity as a final verdict. Where no signature survives, another kind of work begins. Slow, harsh, almost investigative. Not through documents, but through traces. Not through a name, but through manner. This is where art historical analysis enters, that cold instrument capable of pulling individuality out of an anonymous mass through the smallest recurring signs. Researchers compare the carving of faces, the setting of eyes, the handling of drapery, the treatment of background, the distribution of figures in depth, the use of architectural framing, the direction of movement in a crowd, the proportions of bodies. To an untrained eye, all of it may collapse into one overwhelming display of skill. To a specialist, it does not. Differences begin to emerge, and those differences are exactly what allow scholars to speak of different hands. The term hands matters here because it is both precise and merciless. It carries none of the comforting romance of a full biography. It does not promise a noble legend, and it does not lie by pretending that certainty is complete. But it offers at least something solid. If the name is lost, the hand remains. If the person has vanished from the record, that person may still be caught through the habit of the chisel, through the stubborn way a face is shaped, through the character of lines, through the manner in which space is solved inside a microscopic volume. At that level, research begins to resemble detective work. Not who was this in a direct sense, but which marks expose this maker among the others. This applies to one of the most stubborn forms of historical reconstruction. Scholars do not invent authors out of air, they assemble them out of repeated traits. One maker prefers elongated faces and a harder treatment of folds. Another models figures more softly and packs the space more densely with secondary detail. One composition carries more nervous movement, another more symmetry and interior restraint. Out of these repetitions, these visual habits, these professional reflexes, a careful hypothesis begins to rise. This was one hand, and that was another. That is how researchers arrive at the conclusion that prayer nuts were probably not the achievement of a single isolated genius, but of several makers, and perhaps several production centers in different cities of the Low Countries. This is already a serious shift. The story stops looking like a legend about one miraculous carver and begins to resemble a more complex map of a craft world. Somewhere there were workshops linked by a shared visual language. Somewhere there were influences, echoes, borrowings, perhaps training relationships. Somewhere one maker picked up another's solution and drove it to a sharper degree of precision. In this way, a professional environment starts to emerge from anonymous darkness. But clarity never becomes complete. The more scholars manage to distinguish, the more visible the limits of knowledge become. We can speak of groups, circles, centers, habits. We can separate one hand from another. But between those cautious conclusions and the living human being, there still yawns a heavy gap. And inside that gap, another image begins to take shape. Severe, quiet, almost monastic. The image of a maker working in solitude, in silence, in an enclosed space where there is no room for unnecessary gesture and no room for unnecessary speech. This also explains why the figure of the solitary master rises so stubbornly before the imagination of researchers. Work of this kind does not sit comfortably beside noise, haste, or distraction. It demands a special mode of existence, long hours of concentration, an almost painful steadiness of hand, a willingness to repeat the same microscopic motions to the point of exhaustion, and the ability to hold a complex composition in the mind while only a tiny fragment of wood lies before the eye. Labor at this level naturally produces the image of a person cut off from the outer world, living inside the material like a recluse inside a cell. Of course, that does not mean every maker truly worked alone like a hermit, rejecting pupils, patrons, and the ordinary life of a workshop. But the logic of the object itself pushes thought toward a regime of nearly ascetic discipline. The price of error is too high. The span of labor is too long. The scale is too unforgiving to permit carelessness. So even if what stood behind these objects was a workshop rather than a solitary room, the atmosphere inside it must still have been close to spiritual austerity. Not display, but working silence. Not spectacle, but exhausting concentration. This is where analysis unexpectedly joins hands with human imagination. On one side, the scholar must remain cold, comparing, grouping, attributing, distinguishing one hand from another, refusing to substitute elegant speculation for proof. On the other side, the artifacts themselves almost force one to think about the people behind them, not abstractly, not as a mere function of craft, but as distinct temperaments. One may have been harsher and more exact, another more patient in detail, a third stronger in compositional control. Thus, from tiny differences in carving, there begins to emerge not only a map of authorship, but a faint, broken silhouette of human character. And perhaps that is the historian's most stubborn victory over anonymity. The full name is not recovered. No exact portrait appears. The maker is not raised whole out of the ground. But something else happens. The prayer nuts cease to look like the product of faceless hands drifting in the mist of the past. They begin to reveal different makers, different habits, different decisions, different interior schools of thought. That is no longer emptiness. It is the beginning of return. Not the return of the person in full, but at least of the professional signature, the way of seeing, the way of cutting a world into wood. And now it becomes clear why the prayer nut still knocks the ground out from under every comfortable classification. It would be far too easy to call it merely a religious object, far too lazy to file it away as miniature carving, far too superficial to admire the fineness of the work and stop there. That approach collapses the moment one begins to see the object as a whole. What stands before us is not one story, but a fusion of several worlds that almost never meet in such density. That is where its exceptionality lies. The prayer nut is born at the crossing point of religion, jewelry-like craftsmanship, and engineering thought. Not side by side, not one after another, not through accidental overlap, but through a hard internal union. From religion it takes content, ritual, contemplative pressure, and the spiritual burden of image. From the world of fine luxury craftsmanship, it takes minuteness, precious precision, work at the very limit of material, the cult of rarity, and an almost painful exactness of execution. From engineering it takes construction, the mechanics of opening, the calculation of segments, the discipline of joints, and the control of movement and access. Remove even one of these lines, and the whole effect begins to crumble. Without religion, it would be only a virtuoso toy. Without jeweled precision, it would be a coarse cult object. Without engineering, it would be a static miniature, stripped of half its force. That is why the prayer nut cannot honestly be described by any single neat formula. It does not fit inside a tidy box. It refuses to let the modern viewer relax. It is too sacred to count as a mere object, too technically complex to count as a mere religious image, too refined to be reduced to mechanism alone. There are no secondary levels inside it. Every line works at once, and each strengthens the others. Religious meaning gives the construction purpose. Construction gives the image theatrical power. Precision turns the entire thing into a rarity from which the eye cannot withdraw. This applies to the central conclusion of the whole story. The uniqueness of the prayer nut does not lie in one isolated miracle, but in the convergence of several demands that are almost incompatible. It had to be spiritually convincing. It had to be visually overwhelming. It had to be technically exact. It had to remain tiny while containing an enormous narrative. It had to open like a jewel, function like a mechanism, and strike like a miniature altar. That concentration of tasks is almost insane in itself. And yet the makers did not merely attempt it. They drove it to a result that, centuries later, still provokes not calm respect, but a kind of irritated astonishment. That is why no other form of Renaissance microsculpture produces quite the same effect. Yes, there were carved cameos. Yes, there were jeweled objects, reliquaries, complex miniatures, and exquisite details of church and courtly art. But the prayer nut goes further. It is not merely small, not merely intricate, not merely beautiful. It behaves like a compressed civilizational formula. Locked inside it are religious practice, the luxury market, the culture of private contemplation, extreme manual precision, and concealed mechanics. This is no longer just an object. It is a concentration of an age folded down to the size of a hand. The scientific view only intensifies that judgment. The more researchers scan, measure, reconstruct, and compare, the less plausible the existence of such an object seems within the early 16th century. And that is precisely what elevates the prayer nut above other works of microsculpture. It does not simply impress, it breaks the scale of expectation. It forces a revision of what manual craft could do, of what workshop discipline meant, of what Northern European visual culture demanded, and of what the human hand was capable of without modern optics or machine control. This is not a charming exception, it is a serious argument against any condescending view of the past. This also explains why the prayer nut keeps such a stubborn grip on the attention of art historians, conservators, museum specialists, and researchers of visual perception. Each sees something different in it, yet no one can exhaust it completely. For one, it is the summit of devotional miniature. For another, it is the triumph of sustained craft discipline. For a third, it is an almost impossible engineering system in wood. For a fourth, it is the perfect object through which to see faith, power, luxury, and technology lock into a single body. That is not mere interest, it is the intellectual force of the object itself. It resists simplification. So the main thesis must be stated hard and without decoration. The prayer nut is not unique because it is old, rare, or beautiful. That would be far too little. It is unique because it became the point at which religion turned into a pocket cosmos, luxury craftsmanship turned into a hyper-dense form of prestige, and engineering turned into a hidden mechanism of reverence. None of these lines by itself explains the force of the artifact. Only their fusion creates the effect that survived the Reformation, changes in fashion, museum isolation, and even the digital age. That is why the prayer nut still appears not as a minor museum curiosity, but as a defiant piece of evidence that the past was sharper, subtler, and dangerously more exact than many people would prefer to admit. At the end of this story, what remains is the most uncomfortable and the most persistent question. We may list museums, technologies, dates, workshops, religious contexts, and methods of attribution, but none of that cancels the central fact. The prayer nut still refuses to give a final answer to why a human being would submit to such monstrous concentration of labor. Too much strength was poured into an object that almost nobody could fully examine. Too much time was burned for a tiny world hidden inside wood. And so behind the discussion of technique, there rises another, heavier discussion, the discussion of human motive. What drove these makers? Was it only faith? Only the wish to serve the devotional needs of a patron? Only the market, money, prestige, the caprice of a wealthy hand willing to pay for what others could not possess? Or was something more dangerous and more profound at work? The desire to leave behind a thing that would outlive its own age and continue to humiliate descendants by the mere fact of its existence. In objects like these, one always senses not only humility but ambition, not only prayer but challenge. This applies to the hardest duality inside the prayer nut. On one side, it is an instrument of contemplation, a thing meant to lead a person inward, to force the gaze to linger on scenes of suffering, sacrifice, and redemption. On the other side, it is an object in which the will to perfection is almost too strong to ignore, an obstinate refusal to accept the limits of material, scale, and the human hand. That is where the uneasy zone begins. Where does devotion end and the pride of the Maker begin? Where does prayer end and the cold desire to prove the impossible begin? Perhaps that is why these nuts do not release the mind. They are too small for grand language, yet too immense in inner pressure to be dismissed as museum rarities. Two movements keep colliding inside them, downward toward humility and upward toward the conquest of limits. The carver seems at once to bow before the sacred narrative and to argue with the very nature of matter, forcing wood to submit to a nearly unthinkable demand. What one feels here is not peace, but struggle, not completion, but compressed energy that has not dispersed even after centuries. That is why the ending of this story cannot be comfortable. Too much remains unanswered. What lived in the mind of the person who spent years carving faces, folds, gestures, and minute architectural forms where most would have settled for a crude suggestion? What was he trying to save? Faith, beauty, his own name, which we still barely know, or the very sensation of the impossible? And is that not the deepest provocation of the prayer nut? That it forces us to admit that great things are sometimes born not from one cause, but from a dangerous alloy of faith, vanity, discipline, pain, craft obsession, and the stubborn desire to leave a mark that neither Reformation, nor market, nor time itself can erase. This applies to us as well. We look at these objects not only as monuments of a vanished age, we search in them for an answer to our own fear of being forgotten, to our own hunger to exceed the border of the possible, to our own weakness before things in which human will suddenly appears stronger than time. That is why the prayer nut remains unfinished as a theme even now. It does not close inside a museum case, it is not exhausted by a scholarly article, and it does not dissolve into a beautiful story about the past. It continues to ask the one unbearable question that cannot simply be waved away. What is it that makes the human hand truly great? Faith, art, or the desperate desire to defeat oblivion? If this story truly caught your attention, support the video with a like, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to hit the notification bell so you do not miss new investigations, rare facts, and the most uncomfortable mysteries of the past. Write in the comments what you think. Was it faith, the genius of the craftsman, or something even greater? Your opinion matters here. There are many more stories ahead that make the official version start cracking at the seams.